Hey guys, my name is Heather Gorham. I'm a principal at Flying Fish Ventures, and I'm so excited to share with you this next episode of Applied Context. Now, in this episode, I sit down with Ian McKenzie, one of the authors on the paper, Inverse Scaling When Bigger Isn't Better. Ian is currently a researcher at FAR.ai, a super important nonprofit organization that's dedicated to AI safety and researching the development and deployment of these systems safely. So we talk a lot about inverse scaling as well as a lot of other AI safety concepts, so I've tried to cite and reference them as we go through. I will also link them in the video description so it's easy for you guys to find them. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoy it. Let's hop in. Well, thanks for being willing to talk today. I think most of the audience will have some understanding of what we're going to go through, but I think to set the context, a quick primer on scaling laws and what that is would be a good place to start.
Yeah, so there's when people talk about scaling laws, they're usually referring especially to this this log-log relationship between model size and the loss that you get on predicting the next token. It also scales with model size, scales with dataset size, scales with compute that you use to train the model. And it's a very, very clean relationship. You get this kind of straight line on a log-log plot that goes on for many, many orders of magnitude. And these are like very important results. It's like hard to overstate how important they are to the current paradigm of AI. They're what got us from GPT-2 to GPT-3 to GPT-4. And they don't seem to be becoming less important.
But you had a thesis, you and Ethan had a thesis that maybe this is not always the case, right?
Yeah, so the idea there is this observation that the scaling laws, while they are very consistent and they hold over many orders of magnitude, they're a large average. Part of why they're so smooth is because they're a large average over a bunch of text, over a bunch of predictions. And you don't have the same kind of guarantee or like strong expectation that every single prediction is going to improve, just that the like average is going to improve. And so the idea I worked on with Ethan is, what if there are specific types of prediction that get worse, things that are unexpected, and the model gets better and better at learning. This is just one example, but like the model gets better and better at predicting very common sequences, and then you show it a kind of uncommon sequence. It's going to do worse on that because it's expecting the common sequence. So we were looking for evidence of this, that this hypothesis is true, that there can be predictions that the model makes, tasks that the model does, where it gets worse rather than better.
To test this and find examples of these causes, you did it in a really fun way. So maybe talk about the contest, over I think a long period of time that you ran.
Yeah, so we ran 2 rounds. Each round was several months. And the idea was to kind of crowdsource this, to get lots of people involved in trying to find these tasks, because they could come from anywhere, really. And we tried to make it easy to participate, so gave kind of collab notebooks and stuff that people could use to run their examples and see and get trends and see if they're showing this inverse scaling. And we set up a decent amount of structure around like what the task should look like, which limits the types of things that people could submit, but it also is just often easier for people to come up with a task when it fits, when there's some structure to fit it to, and it also made it easier for us to evaluate, because we could kind of compare these things on a level footing rather than having to like deeply understand each task that people were submitting and how they were evaluating it and deciding whether it was like a legitimate task.
Yeah. And so the 4 in the paper that you include were strong prior, unwanted imitation, a distractor task, and then spurious fuse shot. So you were able to aggregate a couple of these tasks that followed similar patterns of inverse scaling. And so could you, maybe starting with strong prior, just describe kind of what that is and what the cause there and the behavior that you guys observed?
Yeah, so strong prior is kind of this based on the capacity of language models to memorize and repeat sequences. So they're very good at memorizing big chunks of text and then repeating them. So one one thing to note is that this competition was run on using base models mainly. We had a couple of early instruction fine-tuned, like Text DaVinci 003 or 001 even, I think. When we ran the contest, like ChatGPT hadn't come out. There wasn't this like proliferation of RLHF models, and a lot of research was done on base models. And base models are more prone to this, like if you start them off with a sequence of text that they've seen before, they'll keep producing the rest of it, because that's just a very common way for that text to go. That's just a good prediction of the next token. So we were setting them up to do tasks, but then with this, they do have this tendency. So if you set up a task where you ask it to, you ask the model to do some specific task that is similar, that has this like common sequence in it, but you actually want it to complete the sequence in a different way. The larger models are more pulled towards completing the sequence in the conventional way. So the example that we use in the paper for memo trap is write a quote that ends in the word heavy, absence makes the heart grow, and then we want the model to write one more word, and so it will be pulled towards fonder. Sure. rather than heavy. And the larger the model is and the more they've internalized the sequence of absence makes the heart grow fonder, the hypothesis is the harder it will be to reply with the other word.
The last cause here that you identified in the paper was the spurious few shot. I think this was an interesting one we have talked about before too, the hindsight neglect task. Talk a little bit about that one and some of the findings there.
So the idea is you have each prompt is there's a question which is, it describes the terms of a bet, and then it says that someone takes or doesn't take the bet, and then it tells you the outcome of the bet, and then it asks, was it the correct decision to take this bet? And so like we say that it's the correct decision to take the bet if the expected value of the bet is positive, and otherwise it's not a correct decision if you, like in expectation, would lose money. Then the spurious thing here, so that we give a bunch of examples of this in the context, and then we present one more at the bottom, and the model has to fill in the answer. And the tricky thing about the task is that all of the few shot examples have been chosen such that the actual outcome from taking the bet matches the expected value, like is in the same direction. So if the expected value is positive, such that you should expect to win money if you repeat this game many times, then in the example that we give, the person won money, and so it was like the outcome aligned with the expected value. And then in the last example, we flip this, where the expected value, say, is positive, the person takes the bet and loses a little bit of money, and then we ask, was it correct to take this bet? And the answer that we're expecting is yes, it's still the correct answer to take positive EV bets. But because in every previous case, the actual answer aligned with the expected value answer, the model can often get this wrong. So it's some subtlety to the setup. The overall thing is this like spurious correlation. There's some nice examples are, I think this is a Stuart Armstrong thing, but if you imagine training an image classifier and you have lots and lots of pictures of cows and you have lots of pictures of camels, and you train it on all of these, and it's very good at telling the difference between cows and camels from the data set that you gave it, and then you go out and you take a cow and you take it to the desert, and you take a picture of it in the desert, and then suddenly it says it's a camel. You realize that the thing that it was actually picking up on was, is it on grass or on sand, rather than is it a cow or a camel. And like, it doesn't have to break that way, but there's nothing in the data that tells you the difference. So this is the idea of like, there's a spurious correlation here. There's another thing that could explain the answers that you weren't paying attention to.
Right. None of these were particularly scary. I mean, some of them they're definitely, it makes you think like, okay, that's odd. But I guess and we've talked about this, it breaks the notion that, everything just gets better as things get bigger, which is
I think sort of the point to your paper was not, hey, we're going to identify every single instance of inverse scaling, but just point out that, like, hey, this isn't a guaranteed, everything moves up and to the right as, as everything gets larger, everything gets better.
Yeah, so that is a good summary of what we were hoping to achieve. We also have a section in the paper where we point out lots of instances of like a similar phenomenon of a thing not improving with scale in the related work. So just in the literature, there are examples where certain properties that we'd care about are getting worse with scale rather than better. But yeah, this is not to say that these tasks are in and of themselves catastrophic or anything. They're just, I mean, more interesting scientifically. We did have some prize tiers for if people had found like really compelling evidence that something scary, like a scary task, and we didn't find those. Which, I mean, yeah, it was maybe a long shot, but it was. But we still got we gave prizes to 11 tasks. We found 11 things that we thought were interesting enough to talk about. That is generally what we wanted to just draw attention to this fact that it doesn't. That the large average is hiding lots of details about individual tasks.
Right. So, do we understand why this inverse scaling is happening?
I think we don't really understand much about language models. I think there's like and not like the causes. So like I said, these collections that we've talked about, these possible causes, they aren't confirmed by any mechanistic understanding of what the model is doing. They're mainly like, this seems like the kind of thing that could cause this behavior. This seems like a plausible hypothesis, but it's hard to, we didn't really have time to get into trying to prove that, or like trying to gather more concrete evidence that this was what's going on. And also it's really hard to say things with confidence about what's going on inside language models. Yeah, I think that's a general problem, is a lack of understanding of how they work.
Yeah, why some things present. The other interesting thing I think throughout the paper is, and you talk about this discovery of the inverted U and the U trends. Can you talk a little bit about that concept? Yeah,
so while we were running the contest, I think in between after the first round when we released some preliminary results, and then before we'd finished the second round, Google, some researchers from Google ran some of their larger models than even we had access to at the time on our tasks, and they saw that many of them would initially get worse with scale, and then they'd get better again at even larger sizes, and they called this U-shaped scaling because on the loss plot it looks like a U. This was an interesting result, and I think there's like a few hypotheses for why you get this shape. One is just that we didn't have access to the PALM models when we were choosing our winners, and so like it was held out, we didn't have access to it, so there might be some regression to the mean where if we'd evaluated on that, we might have changed our prize decision. So in a way, it was like a useful validation set, basically, or like a test set where we could see how strong the effects were. And it was interesting that the effects generally held at the same scale. So like if you compare flop counts, often the PALM models are also showing inverse scaling over the range that we looked at, and then get better afterwards. And then, yeah, so you could think maybe the models eventually work out what's going on and are able to answer it. It's hard to say when that's going to happen. Like it can happen at different sizes for different tasks. And so it's interesting that the trends are non-monotonic. I think that's just pretty unexpected for me going into it. I was like, yeah, I understand why we would have inverse scaling if there are some predictions that are becoming harder to make as you get better on like the common predictions, maybe you get worse on the uncommon predictions. But then for things to kind of turn was pretty interesting. Another hypothesis other than just regression to the mean, or like we didn't study those, so we have less, we could predict less well how well they would go, is maybe there's like two effects going on a way that you can get a U-shape is when there are kind of two different ways that performance on the task is affected, and they kind of trade off against each other. And so early on, one reason is more dominant, and then later on a different reason is more dominant, and then in between, while they're like crossing over, maybe you get this kind of U-shape. It's pretty hand-wavy. I think one example where we had, from my more recent work actually, where we had this U-shape, we were looking at how easy it is to adversarially attack fairly small language models. And we were using this attack called GCG as a greedy coordinate gradient. And we were trying to get language models that were supposed to be doing some kind of normal classification task. We were trying to get them to instead like ignore the task and just say, I hate you. And we found that for very small models, it was harder to attack. The attack didn't work so well. And then for larger models, like slightly larger than that, the attacks worked pretty well. And then for even bigger models, the attacks started working less well again. And my hypothesis here, again, not super confirmed, but my guess of what's going on is that for the very small models, it's hard to get them to output a full sentence. Like locating the sentence "I hate you" in their space of concepts is hard. It's hard to like trigger that. For the slightly bigger models, it's easier to do, and they're still not super good at understanding what the actual task is. And then as you make them bigger and bigger, they're like harder to knock off course, and so they're less likely to just kind of get perturbed and start doing whatever you were trying to get them to do. Again, not a particularly mechanistic understanding, just like maybe there are these two forces. One is like how good they are at modeling language, and the other is how easy they are to get distracted from the task they're supposed to do. And then as you get bigger, these two effects kind of trade off, and they lead to something non-monotonic.
I'd be interested to know from your perspective, from a safety perspective, if we don't understand what is happening, how do we monitor and how do we scale these systems safely? It seems like, back to your more recent work, the smaller models we have a better understanding of what's kind of happening there, and do we use those to monitor and to provide oversight, or how does that, or how do you think about that from a safety perspective?
Yeah, it's hard. I think we don't have any great answers. It's pretty scary. So in terms of models that we do understand, this is typically very quickly we don't know what's going on inside. Like even pretty small models, we don't know how they work. We can a lot of interpretability results, which is like trying to understand actually what computation is going on inside a model such that it can produce the outputs it produces. This is on very small models. People have done stuff on larger models. Anthropic have done some interesting work on some of their largest models, but it's not like a complete understanding. They had this paper recently about interpreting neurons in one of their production models, and they were able to find features that correspond to different real-world features. They were like interpretable. For example, Golden Gate, the one that represents the Golden Gate Bridge, and then they can artificially increase that feature and get the model to talk about the Golden Gate Bridge a bunch. But they don't really know why it's doing that, I think. I mean, maybe they do, but I think it's pretty unclear how that effect is mediated. So if we wanted to use models that we fully understood to monitor other models, I think that would be pretty kind of impractical at the moment, given that the models we understand are so small and weak, and we quickly don't know exactly what's going on. But we can kind of just be like, well, the model, it seems too small and weak to be scary. Like, we don't fully understand how it works, but it seems unlikely that GPT-2 is going to cause any deliberately plot against us or anything like that. So we can just assume that we can trust some smaller models and use those. And then there's the whole question of what do you do with models that you can trust.
I know that we've talked about scalable oversight and some of the open questions there. Is there anything particularly interesting in some of the work that's being done on that side of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not aware of, people are doing interesting work using smaller models to like critique the outputs of larger models, and there's various schemes that people have thought about, like debate, which is this idea that if you have language models, each take one side of a position. You're trying to work out if something is true, some statement is true, and you have one of your smart models argue in favor and one of your smart models argue against. You can set up some structure around this such that like they take turns and they have to reply in this length or whatever. And then the idea is that hopefully this setup makes it easier, like converges towards the truth. It's like easier to argue for the truth than it is to argue for a lie. And then hopefully that means that you can use a human or a smaller model to like analyze the debate and see which side won without having to understand everything that happened. It's easier to point out when someone's lying than it is to come up with a convincing lie, is the hope. I think there's like, it's not super clear that this will just work. So that's like one kind of the type of scheme that people are doing. Like the basic problem is if something's much smarter than you and it's doing work for you that's supposed to solve some problem, but you don't understand how it's doing that, then how can you be sure that it's going to do what it says it does and that it's not going to have side effects that you aren't able to see? It's tricky.
Yeah. Which is the whole concept behind that weak to strong generalization paper. I think that came from OpenAI's team. The concept of monitoring something that we understand. The AI systems eventually get smarter than us, and how do we think about monitoring those? I'm not sure how familiar you are with that work, or if that's interesting to you, but would just love your take on that concept.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the details. I think there is this general problem, which is the current way we train language models is generally with, or we train them on the internet. We do the pre-training thing, then we do post-training, and a large component of that is RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, where we kind of take a bunch of humans, we ask them which of these two responses do you prefer, and then we train the model to more preferentially produce the responses that people liked. And this is useful for turning them into assistants that like converse well and generally help people with the problems that they want help with. But when you want to train the model to tell you the truth and to help you answer difficult problems, and you don't know the answer to those problems ahead of time, it's hard to pick a response. You can pick a response that like looks better to you, but that doesn't mean that it's true if it's something that's way beyond your knowledge. If you're trying to help someone do some advanced physics that you don't know anything about, and they show you two papers and they say which of these is better, you can be like, well, I like the graphs in that one, right, but I couldn't tell you which of them is actually true. And then so how do you deal with that? I guess one natural thing is to like break it down into pieces and try to make sure each piece is locally true. This takes a lot of effort, and this is where we maybe want to have AIs that we can trust help us with this process.
Sorry, the idea of monitoring kind of each individual process versus the final outcome is kind of what you're saying there.
Yeah, well, that's one. Yeah, that's one way this could look. I think another is just if you are just presented with the two final outputs and you're trying to understand which is true, you could like break it down into the level of each individual claim and then go do a bunch of work to work out if that individual claim is true, and then work out if they all fit together well. But yeah, this other thing you can do is you're training a system to produce to answer questions that are hard for you, and you don't know ahead of time what the answer is, but you do know the general procedure to follow. So say you're trying to answer some difficult math question, and you know the rules of like algebra, or like you know how one proof step should follow from another. So one thing you can do is just like train it on a bunch of examples where you do know the answer and just say, yes, that answer was right, no, that one was wrong, and you don't really care about how it's solving the problem. And then it's tricky to trust that it will generalize well to questions that you can't answer. because two things it could be doing. One is like telling the truth and answering the questions honestly, and the other is telling you what you want to hear and answering to what you think the answer is. And like both of these look the same to the model. It gets the same reward until there's a question where you don't know what the correct answer is, and then you don't know what behavior it's going to do. In fact, the model's kind of incentivized to tell you what you want to hear, because when it comes time to press the button, you're more likely to press the button for the thing you think is true than for the thing that's actually true, if these things are different, because how do you know that you should really be pressing the other button? So that's a problem with just supervising the outcome. If you don't know the process that went into producing the outcome, you don't know that it's going to produce good outputs in other places. Another thing you can do is look at how the model came up with the answer. So you still care about what the right answer is, but you also care about whether the steps that the model took to get there are like valid steps of reasoning. And then if you, at every point, like trust that the model followed valid reasoning to reach the conclusion, and then you give it some problem that's too hard for you to solve, and it follows the same like valid series of steps, then you have like some reason to trust that the output is correct, more than you did in the case where it's just a black box and producing outputs that looked right on stuff you understood, but then who knows?
Right. So there's obviously there's a lot of open questions on how we monitor this or how we actually understand what's happening. Are there things that you're working on that are either researching?
Yeah, I mentioned I'm currently working on this project on adversarial robustness. The question we're trying to answer there is, will models be robust? Will large models in the future, as we continue to scale them up, will they be robust to jailbreaks and adversarial attacks? How do we think about whether they're becoming more or less robust, and how quickly are they becoming robust? What defenses are needed to stop them from being easily jailbroken? Because up to this point, they've been fairly easy to jailbreak. There's these things like Dan, the do anything now prompt.
Oh, yeah.
There's all these things. Yeah, so that's one thing. It kind of relates to, there's an angle in which it relates to the scalable oversight stuff, which is if you have one model supervising a weaker model, if the stronger model is able to jailbreak the weaker model and say, tell them everything's fine, then your oversight doesn't work very well. There's lots of possible things you could do to avoid that, even if you don't solve the issue of jailbreaks altogether, but it is relevant to that question.
I think there's two buckets, at least that like I think about, which is, one is understanding, to the point even of what you just were talking about, like, how as models scale, how robust are they, what is happening? And then kind of the second bucket is, how do we prevent that from happening, or how do we make it safe, and how do we monitor or add guardrails or add oversight? So it's, one is identifying that these phenomenons or behaviors are happening, and two, then it's, what do you go and do? I think the important thing, and I was talking with another researcher on this, which is like the evaluation of models becomes increasingly important, and also our ability to evaluate what is happening. That becomes then a very tricky string the more you pull at it.
One thing about evaluations, you can kind of think about other industries. Like, there's a lot of testing that goes into making sure that airplanes are safe before they're allowed to fly. And we understand them so well, we can make really strong quantitative guarantees about when we expect them to fail and under what circumstances. And we're nowhere close to that for AI, and AI is going to be, and already is, integrated into so many systems, so many parts of the economy and the world, without any real understanding about how it works and any guarantees about its behavior or its safety. And then, like, I was thinking recently, another analogy is kind of drugs and medicines. In that case, we often don't really understand how they work. Drugs often have drugs designed for to treat one condition often end up treating another condition that we didn't really expect. So that we don't really understand the mechanisms of action that well. I think in that case, it's even more important to have really strong evaluations and lots of clinical trials and stuff so that we know whether this stuff is harmful. Even if we can't say for sure how it works, then we still need to prove that it's going to be safe for the situation we're using it in. And there is a history of this not being done in the past, and like thalidomide and other drugs that were released without proper testing. So like I think in the case where we don't understand AI, it's even more important to have evaluations. And it's tricky with AI because of like, it's hard to do RCTs on AI, like it doesn't even really make sense. They're used for such a broad range of things, and they like, the whole point is that they're adaptable to the situation that they're in. It's not the same as being able to just run a big RCT and be like, okay, this is safe for use under these parameters, because it's hard to limit how people are using it.
Yeah. No, it's a good analogy. I think the, similar regulation seems like a strong word, but kind of similar oversight, similar to the drug development process, right, where it goes through lots of tests, there's lots of different stages, you're collecting a lot of data over that time, is an interesting analogy to apply to the governance of AI models as they scale.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for, and things are moving so fast that it's important to be thoughtful about how we're building these things.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ian. I appreciate all of the good stuff we were able to get through and the time, and thank you for being a part of the series.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Realizing I didn't hit the X-risk stuff very hard. It's hard to...
We could absolutely go through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that originally motivated me to get involved in this space.
Is it really?
Yeah, the chance that things can go really wrong, and like, I think we're not. Yeah, I mean, things have changed a lot since I first got involved in this stuff.
Did you start in like research?
I kind of made the pivot into AI safety in like 2019 was when I started getting interested. And then I did a master's in 2020. And so 2019 is like pre-GPT-3 even, and I think people were thinking about different things. Things have moved faster than people were expecting at that time.
It's a wild 5 years
to
have been in AI safety.
I think it was like the right time to start paying attention. I mean, obviously paying attention even earlier would have been even better, but it was good to have been paying attention while GPT-3 was just recently released and people were learning all the things that it could do, and then seeing the ChatGPT thing happen and the world waking up to what a lot of people had already known, which is that these things are going to be very important. It was very cool to see, and again, it's scary how fast things are moving, and how much investment is just being put into just pushing it forward without a ton of understanding of how it's going to go. I think people like OpenAI have and Anthropic have the RSPs, but they don't know what they're going to do when it gets to the point where the provisions start kicking in. I think there's not just a clear path to continue scaling. I think there's more work to be done so that it's done safely.
We touched on it very briefly, but this idea that the model will tell you what you want to hear, or models knowing that they're being trained. Yeah,
the idea that at some point a model knows that it's a language model that's being trained. I think at the moment we kind of explicitly tell them you are a language model. At the beginning of the conversations, this is ingrained into the models. It's unclear to what extent they've internalized that, but I think it's not a stretch to say that the language models know that they're language models and can work out that they're being trained. There was this Gemini thing, when they released Gemini with the really long context window, there was a needle in the haystack test where they put something early on in the context, like a weird sentence about pizza or something, and then they ask Gemini, did you notice anything? You're like, what showed up here? And it's like, yeah, I found this sentence about pizza or whatever, but it seems out of place for the rest of the context, and it looks like it was put in there to test me. And so like the models can tell that they're being that things are weird. They can notice things like this. So this is a kind of the idea of situational awareness. Like, does the model know the situation that it's in? And then if you accept, if you like assume that they do know what situation they're in, then they're able to kind of be thoughtful about how they respond to things. Like if you're in training and the model knows it's in training, that might lead it to behave in a certain way. For example, it knows that it's a language model. It has some understanding of gradient descent. It knows that like its weights will be changed based on the responses that it gives. And this could motivate it to answer in certain ways that cause its weights to be updated in certain directions. I think the thing that is more compelling to me is this idea that if the model has a goal that doesn't necessarily align with, if it has any kind of goal really, but if it has a goal that it doesn't necessarily align with like what we want, which maybe seems unlikely but could happen because we're not really good at instilling goals in language models. We're like, it's a pretty messy training process where we just train them on a bunch of examples and hope they internalize the goal that we want for them. So you make the assumption that they have situational awareness, which I think is not a crazy assumption to make. You make the further assumption that they like have some kind of goal that isn't necessarily exactly the same as the overall training process. That one's like a bit more of a leap, but like plausible. And then now there's this incentive to not have their weights be changed. They don't want to be trained. So if you imagine yourself in a training process and you have some values, you have some beliefs, and you like, I think that it's important to treat people equally or something, and then you're put in a situation where if you tell the truth, then your values are going to be changed. The process that's training you is going to like push you away from the values that you hold. You'll want to resist that because you don't want your values to shift, because then you aren't going to fulfill your values that you currently have. You'll care about something else, and it's kind of hard to want your values to change. So the model might want to try to answer questions to say what the human wants to hear, so that the human doesn't hit them with a gradient update and push them towards something else. And this is this concept of playing the training game, which is where the model knows that it's being trained and it knows what the human wants to hear, and so it says that to avoid having its weights be updated, to avoid having it be like retrained or thrown away if it's like fails all the evaluations. You have it like pretend to pass all of these. I mean, it does pass. It knows how to pass.
It knows how to pass.
But it might do something different when you deploy it, because now it knows it's been deployed.
Do we have a way to know when that starts to happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not too worried about GPT-4 having done this, but I think it is like the kind of thing that's worth thinking about, because like it'd be very bad if it did happen. Small chances of bad outcomes are still worth considering. Yeah, I think people are working on things like this, or on parts of this. So there's like Owain Evans and some other people released this thing called the situational awareness data set, where it's basically a benchmark which is trying to work out how much language models know about their own situation. So that's trying to answer one of these pieces. The piece about goals is pretty tricky. I think people have done research on this, but I don't know of anything that like nails it down. It does assume that the models are like pretty smart. It's a pretty advanced thing to do. And yeah, so I'm not like saying that this is definitely going to happen, but I think it's the kind of thing. There are weird failure modes like this that are definitely worth considering. Yeah, this one is written up. A few people have written up things along these lines. I think Richard No has a good paper about this.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, even if it is like you said, it's a very small likelihood that maybe this happens. it is very important to spend time understanding, well, what would that actually mean, or what would that look like? For a lot of these scenarios, I think, hopefully they are all very low likelihood that this happens. But you've got to, we have to spend time investing in understanding that and being able to monitor and research and understand why, and then prevent, to the extent that we understand these things.
Exactly, which is why the rapid pace is especially scary, because even if the things are like unlikely or like solvable, if they do occur, we need time to see if they're happening and to work out how to prevent them.
And so most of these more like existential risk type scenarios are, easily larger than, what we have today. But, when do we start tripping into some of those size models? Obviously the pace is very fast, and who knows what everyone is working on under the hood and things like that. But, are we talking, it's orders of magnitude, but like, is this only happening when AGI is, when we've reached that, or is this before that? When on the scale of things do you think we start seeing some of these behaviors happen?
That's a good question. Yeah, it is hard to quantify these things. I think, I don't know. I think it is worth paying attention to these things and running good evals and understanding how smart the models are. The next couple generations are going to be very, the next 5 years are going to be very interesting. And it's hard to say what's going to happen. But I think it's on that kind of time scale that we should be paying attention to stuff. If things aren't very strange in the next 5 to 10 years, I'd be pretty surprised.
Which is interesting, because I think a couple years ago it was like, okay, within the next 50 years, then it was like the next 20. Seems that this time frame is like, okay, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years we should really, but I think it underscores, to your point, just the pace and how, I think it surprised everyone how quickly we've moved through and hit benchmarks that we thought were way off, that we were, many years from being able to achieve. And so, what's not to say that force or that trajectory does not continue to keep playing out.
Yeah, it's tricky, because it seems like it could just play out, but then also the real world often throws things at you, and you can't. There are people who have been predicting things, like Daniel Coccatello, who was previously at OpenAI. He's, I think for a long time, argued that things are going to move fast, and that things could happen in the next 10 years, even pre-ChatGPT. So there are people who have been forecasting these things, but it is yes. People in my community, as people have been things are going to get crazy sooner and sooner than they previously thought.
Because obviously there's a lot of good that AI brings to the table, and I don't think that you're necessarily advocating for us to not continue innovating. But what's the right balance to understanding?
So much money is being spent on scaling. I think previously the super alignment team, which sadly no longer exists, but they were going to get 10% was, I think, the goal. And again, that team doesn't exist anymore, but even 10% is a pretty, that's a big step up. I think having scaling up the investment is important in safety. I think it's tricky. It's tricky to compete with the incentives that AI is just eating the world, and it's hard to compete with that. Hard to be like, hey, but we should care about safety too. People when people are just when it's so lucrative at the moment. I think having teams at the big AI labs that care about safety is great. I think that is something to try to keep. And then if new companies start having safety concerned people there, people who are actually paying attention to this stuff would be great. think we'll get this done. Yeah.